My son stood in my living room, his face red with anger, demanding I sign over the estate immediately. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears as I clutched the armrest of the chair my late husband had refinished 40 years ago. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains I'd hung when we first moved into this house, and everything felt surreal. This was my boy, the child I'd raised, now treating me like an obstacle between him and money that wasn't even his yet. I'm 72 years old, and I never imagined I'd be sitting here writing this. But sometimes life forces you to face truths you've spent years avoiding. My name is Margaret, and this is the story of how my only son tried to manipulate me out of everything my husband and I built together, and how I discovered the real reason behind his desperation. What unfolded over those next few months changed not just our relationship, but my entire understanding of family loyalty and elder respect. The estate wasn't massive by any means, but it represented 50 years of careful planning. My husband Robert and I had purchased this 3-bedroom home in 1978 for $32,000. We'd saved every penny, worked double shifts, and invested wisely. Robert passed 2 years ago from a sudden heart attack, leaving me the house, a modest investment portfolio, worth about $400,000, and a small cabin up north that we'd built together over 10 summers. The plan had always been simple. I would live comfortably on the investments, and when I passed, everything would go to our son, Daniel, and his 2 children. But 6 months after Robert's funeral, Daniel started changing. At first, it was subtle. He'd visit more often, which I welcomed because grief had left me hollow inside. The house felt too quiet, without Robert's morning whistling or the sound of his slippers shuffling to the coffee maker. Daniel would ask casual questions about my finances, whether I'd spoken to the estate lawyer, if I'd updated the will. I brushed it off as concern. After all, wasn't it natural for a son to worry about his aging mother's affairs? The kitchen table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together became a battleground. Daniel would arrive unannounced, usually around dinner time, and start conversations that always circled back to the estate. His wife Linda stopped coming with him, which should have been my first real warning sign. Linda had always been the buffer between Daniel's intensity and my quiet nature. Without her there, our conversations grew tense. One evening in late September, as I was preparing my usual Tuesday pot roast, Daniel showed up with papers, legal documents. He spread them across the table, pushing aside the salt and pepper shakers Robert had brought back from our honeymoon in Maine. My hands trembled as I looked at the bold letters across the top. Transfer of property deed. Daniel's voice was urgent, almost frantic. He explained that transferring the house and assets to him now would save thousands in estate taxes. He talked about probate complications, legal fees, and how much simpler everything would be if we just made the change immediately. His words came fast, tumbling over each other, and I felt overwhelmed by the financial jargon. I'm not ignorant about money, but Robert had always handled the complex investment decisions while I managed our day-to-day finances. I told Daniel I needed time to think, that I wanted to consult with our estate lawyer before making any decisions. His reaction shocked me. His face darkened, and he accused me of not trusting him. He said I was being stubborn and paranoid, that he was only trying to help. The words stung like ice water thrown in my face. This wasn't the boy I'd raised, the child I'd rocked through chicken pox and helped with homework until midnight. After Daniel left that night, I sat alone in the dim living room, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. The house creaked with familiar sounds, but they felt ominous now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. My instincts, honed over 7 decades of life, were screaming at me to be careful. The next morning, I called our estate lawyer, Martin Fletcher, who'd handled our affairs for 20 years. Martin had silver hair and a calm demeanor that reminded me of Robert. When I described Daniel's visit and the documents he'd brought, Martin went silent for a long moment. Then he asked me a question that changed everything. Did I know Daniel had been asking him about early distribution of the estate for months? My stomach dropped. Martin explained that Daniel had contacted him repeatedly, claiming I was becoming forgetful and might need someone to manage my finances. He'd suggested putting Daniel's name on my bank accounts, transferring assets into a family trust that Daniel would control, and even hinted that I might be developing memory issues. Martin had refused to make any changes without speaking directly to me, which is why he was calling now to verify. I felt betrayal wash over me like a cold wave. Memory issues? I balanced my checkbook to the penny every month. I managed my own medications, drove myself to appointments, volunteered at the community center twice a week. I wasn't some confused, elderly woman who needed her son to take control. But Daniel had been painting that picture to our lawyer, probably to others too. Martin advised me to be cautious and suggested I might want to review all my financial accounts. His tone was professional, but I could hear the concern underneath. After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table with my morning coffee growing cold, staring at the floral pattern on the cup. This cup had survived 3 moves, 2 children, and countless ordinary mornings. Now everything felt uncertain. I decided to do something I'd never done before: investigate my own son. It felt wrong, like betraying the fundamental trust between parent and child. But Robert used to say that trust without verification was just hoping for the best. I needed to know what was really happening. I started with our shared family cell phone plan. Daniel was still on it because he'd convinced me years ago it was cheaper to keep everyone together. I logged into the account online, something my granddaughter had taught me how to do last Christmas. The phone records showed hundreds of calls to numbers I didn't recognize. I wrote down several and started searching them online. The first number belonged to a casino in Atlantic City. The second was a gambling helpline. The third was a debt collection agency. My hands started shaking again as I continued searching. Call after call to casinos, sports betting services, and collection agencies. The pattern was unmistakable. Daniel had a gambling problem, and based on the frequency of these calls, it was severe. But that was only the beginning of what I'd discover. Over the next week, I became an investigator in my own family's life. I checked my credit report, something Martin had suggested, and found that Daniel had tried to open a credit card in my name 6 months earlier. The application had been denied because the credit bureau flagged it as suspicious and sent me a notification letter that I dismissed at the time as junk mail. I drove to the bank where Robert and I had kept our accounts for 40 years. The manager, a kind woman named Patricia, who'd helped us refinance the house years ago, pulled me into her office when I explained why I was there. She looked uncomfortable as she pulled up my account history. 3 months ago, Daniel had come in claiming I'd sent him to make a withdrawal from my savings account. He had my date of birth, social security number, and enough personal information to seem legitimate. Patricia had refused the transaction without my direct authorization and had made a note in the system to require my presence for any future changes. I thanked her with tears in my eyes. If Patricia hadn't been vigilant, Daniel might have already taken thousands from my savings. She offered to put additional security measures on all my accounts, requiring 2-form identification and a unique password only I would know. I agreed immediately. Driving home, I felt physically sick. The son I'd raised, who I'd sacrificed so much for, was systematically trying to steal from me. But I needed to know the full extent of his deception before confronting him. I contacted Linda, Daniel's wife, something I'd been avoiding because their marriage seemed strained. We met for coffee at a small cafe near her work. Linda looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. When I gently asked about Daniel, she broke down crying. The truth poured out. Daniel had been gambling for 5 years, starting with online poker and escalating to sports betting and eventually casino trips. He'd lost over $200,000. Their savings were gone. They'd refinanced their house twice. Linda had taken a second job just to keep up with the mortgage payments. She'd begged him to get help, but he kept promising he'd quit, that the next big win was coming. When Robert died, Linda said, Daniel saw my inheritance as the solution to all his problems. He'd become obsessed with getting access to the estate, convinced he could use the money to pay off his debts and start fresh. He'd lied to her about his conversations with me, claiming I'd agreed to help but was dragging my feet on the paperwork. Linda apologized over and over, tears streaming down her face. She said she should have warned me sooner, but she'd been terrified of destroying what was left of our family. She'd hoped Daniel would come to his senses, that hitting rock bottom would force him to change. Instead, he'd just dug deeper, dragging everyone down with him. I held Linda's hand across the coffee shop table and told her this wasn't her fault. She was a victim, too, trapped in a situation created by addiction and lies. We talked for 2 hours, and by the end we'd formed an alliance. Linda agreed to forward me any financial documents or communications that showed the extent of Daniel's gambling debts. In return, I promised to help her protect herself and her children from the fallout that was coming. Over the next 2 weeks, Linda sent me bank statements, credit card bills, and loan documents. The scope of Daniel's financial destruction was staggering. He owed money to 3 different casinos, had maxed out 7 credit cards, taken out 2 personal loans, and borrowed from his 401k. The total debt was approaching $300,000. But little did I know, the real shock was still coming. Among the documents Linda sent was a legal notice from a company I didn't recognize. I researched the name and discovered it was a reverse mortgage company. Daniel had been researching how to take out a reverse mortgage on my house, which would give him access to the equity while I was still living. The paperwork required my signature, but based on the dates, he'd been planning this for months before even approaching me with the property transfer documents. The manipulation was calculated and cold. Daniel wasn't just desperate. He'd developed an entire strategy to systematically strip me of everything Robert and I had built. The property transfer was just the first step. Once he had control, he could mortgage, sell, or leverage every asset without my knowledge or consent. I felt anger building inside me, replacing the grief and betrayal. This was my home, my security, my legacy. Robert and I had worked too hard and sacrificed too much for it to be gambled away by our son's addiction. I was done being the confused elderly mother Daniel was portraying to lawyers and creditors. It was time to act. I scheduled an appointment with Martin Fletcher to revise my entire estate plan. We spent 3 hours in his office, and I explained everything I'd discovered. Martin listened carefully, taking notes, his expression growing more serious as the full picture emerged. He recommended several immediate steps to protect my assets and ensure Daniel couldn't manipulate me into signing anything under pressure. First, we created a new living trust with me as the sole trustee during my lifetime. Upon my death, a professional trustee would manage the estate distribution to prevent Daniel from accessing a lump sum he could immediately gamble away. Instead, my grandchildren would receive controlled distributions for education and specific needs, with the principal protected until they reached 35. Second, Martin drafted a durable power of attorney, naming Linda and my niece Rebecca as co-agents. This ensured that if I ever did become incapacitated, Daniel couldn't claim sole authority over my affairs. Both women would need to agree on any major decisions, providing checks and balances. Third, we added specific language to my will, stating that any heir who contested the estate plan or attempted to manipulate me financially would be disinherited completely. Martin called it a no-contest clause, and he assured me it was legally enforceable given the documentation I'd gathered. Finally, Martin helped me file a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services about Daniel's attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person. I struggled with this decision because it felt like betraying my own child to the authorities. But Martin gently reminded me that Daniel's actions weren't just morally wrong. They were potentially criminal. If I didn't report it, he might try the same tactics with other vulnerable people, including his own children someday. The paperwork was signed, notarized, and filed within a week. I felt both empowered and heartbroken. I'd protected myself, but I'd also had to accept that my son valued money more than our relationship. The confrontation came on a cold November afternoon. I invited Daniel over, telling him I'd made a decision about the estate. He arrived within 20 minutes, his eagerness palpable. He actually smiled as he walked through the door, probably thinking he'd finally worn me down. We sat in the living room, the same room where he'd first demanded I sign over the estate months earlier. I'd placed the folder of documents on the coffee table between us. Daniel's eyes locked onto it immediately, and I could see the anticipation in his expression. I started calmly, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. I told Daniel I knew about the gambling, the debts, the lies to our lawyer, the attempted credit card fraud, the reverse mortgage research, everything. I watched the color drain from his face as I listed each betrayal, methodically, like reading items from a grocery list. Daniel tried to interrupt, to explain, to justify, but I held up my hand. I'd spent 72 years learning when to be soft and when to be firm. This moment required firmness. I explained that I'd revised my entire estate plan. The house, investments, and cabin would be held in trust with professional management. His children would be provided for through controlled distributions for education and necessities, but Daniel himself would receive nothing. I'd also named Linda and Rebecca as my power of attorney agents, removing any possibility that he could claim control if I became ill. Then I told him about the complaint filed with Adult Protective Services. His face went from pale to red, anger and panic mixing in his expression. He stood abruptly, knocking over the side table and sending Robert's reading lamp crashing to the floor. The words he shouted are burned into my memory. He called me selfish, cruel, a terrible mother who didn't understand what real problems were like. He accused me of ruining his life, of choosing money over my own son, of being vindictive and heartless. The venom in his voice felt like physical blows. I stayed seated, maintaining my composure even as my heart raced. When he finally ran out of steam, breathing hard and looking lost, I spoke again. I told him I loved him, that I always would, but that love didn't mean enabling his self-destruction. I'd watched him spiral for too long, hoping he'd change on his own. Instead, he'd tried to pull me down with him. I offered him a choice. He could get help, real professional help for his gambling addiction. I would support his recovery emotionally, attend family counseling sessions, and be there when he was ready to rebuild his life honestly. But I would not fund his addiction or allow him to manipulate me into giving him money that would only feed the disease. If he chose recovery, we could work toward rebuilding trust over time. The estate plan would remain as written to protect everyone involved, but our relationship didn't have to be destroyed. If he chose to continue down his current path, then he'd have to face the consequences without dragging me or his family down with him. Daniel stared at me for a long moment, emotions flickering across his face too fast to identify. Then he turned and walked out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I sat alone in the suddenly quiet room, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. Standing up to my son was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but I knew it was necessary. The weeks that followed were difficult. Daniel didn't contact me, and I heard through Linda that he'd moved out of their house to stay with a friend. Linda filed for legal separation, prioritizing protecting herself and the children from his financial chaos. She kept me updated on the kids, sending pictures and letting me visit them when Daniel wasn't around. My grandchildren, Sarah and Matthew, were confused about why their father wasn't living at home and why they couldn't see Grandma and Grandpa together anymore. Linda and I carefully explained that their dad was working through some problems and needed space to get better. We reassured them constantly that they were loved and that none of this was their fault. Around Christmas, 2 months after our confrontation, I received a letter from Daniel. It was handwritten on lined notebook paper, his messy scrawl barely legible. He wrote that he'd hit rock bottom after I'd cut him off. He'd borrowed money from people he shouldn't have, missed work, and finally, one night in a casino parking lot, he'd sat in his car contemplating how much easier everything would be if he just didn't exist anymore. That moment of desperation had shocked him into calling a gambling addiction hotline. He'd talked to a counselor for over an hour, and they'd helped him find an inpatient treatment program. He'd been in rehab for 6 weeks when he wrote the letter. He said he understood now that he'd been using gambling to avoid dealing with his father's death, his career frustrations, and his own feelings of inadequacy. He apologized for trying to manipulate me, for lying, for putting his addiction above our relationship. He didn't ask for money or make promises about the future. He simply said he was sorry and that he hoped someday I might be willing to talk to him again when he was further along in recovery. I cried reading that letter, relief and sorrow mixing together. My son was getting help. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but at least he'd taken the first step. I wrote back immediately, expressing my pride in his decision to seek treatment and my commitment to supporting his recovery without enabling his addiction. We started communicating through letters while he was in rehab, then occasional supervised phone calls. The conversations were stilted at first, both of us dancing around the hurt and betrayal. But gradually, we found our way back to more honest communication. Daniel attended daily therapy sessions, 12-step meetings, and financial counseling. He was learning about the root causes of his addiction and developing healthier coping mechanisms. When Daniel completed the 90-day inpatient program, he moved into a sober living facility rather than returning to his old environment. He found a new job in a different field, something that didn't involve the high-pressure sales environment that had contributed to his stress. He worked on repairing his relationship with Linda and the kids, attending family therapy sessions and slowly rebuilding trust. It's been 18 months now since that November confrontation, and the progress has been remarkable, but incomplete. Daniel is closing in on 2 years of sobriety from gambling. He's made amends to many people he'd hurt or manipulated, including a tearful apology to me in Martin Fletcher's office, where he acknowledged the full extent of his attempted financial exploitation. Linda and Daniel are working on their marriage through counseling. She hasn't dismissed the separation, but they're dating again, taking things slowly and rebuilding the foundation that gambling destroyed. The kids are seeing their father regularly, under Linda's supervision, and the relationships are gradually healing. Daniel knows the estate plan remains unchanged. We've discussed it in therapy, and he's expressed understanding and even gratitude that I protected the family's future. He's working on his own financial recovery, paying down debt slowly but consistently, and building healthy money management skills. I've made it clear that changing the estate plan isn't contingent on his recovery, though I've left open the possibility of modest adjustments years down the road, if sustained sobriety continues. More importantly, I've established that our relationship's value isn't measured in inheritance, but in genuine connection, honesty, and mutual respect. The cabin up north has become a place of healing for our family. I've invited Daniel and the grandchildren to visit on holidays and summer weekends. We're building new memories there, ones not tainted by financial manipulation or lies. Last 4th of July, Daniel helped me repair the dock that Robert had built years ago, working side by side in comfortable silence, punctuated by occasional conversation. One afternoon during that visit, as we watched Sarah and Matthew splashing in the lake, Daniel said something I'll never forget. He told me that my willingness to stand firm against his manipulation probably saved his life. If I'd given in, he would have gambled away everything within months and ended up even more desperate and hopeless. By refusing to enable him, by choosing tough love over easy peace, I'd forced him to face consequences that ultimately led to treatment. That conversation brought tears to both our eyes. It represented a full-circle moment from the anger and betrayal of 18 months earlier. We weren't magically fixed, but we were healing. I've learned profound lessons through this ordeal about elder empowerment and family boundaries. For too long, I'd worried about being the difficult mother, the one who didn't trust her son enough or who cared too much about money. Society has this narrative that good mothers sacrifice everything, including their own security, for their children's happiness. But that's not love. That's enabling. True love sometimes means saying no. It means protecting yourself and your loved ones from destructive behavior, even when it's painful. It means recognizing that you have value and rights regardless of your age, and that respecting elders isn't just about being polite. It's about honoring the dignity and autonomy of people who've spent decades building lives and earning wisdom. I also learned the importance of having advocates and support systems. Patricia at the bank, Martin the lawyer, Linda's courage to tell me the truth, and my niece Rebecca's steady support. All these people formed a safety net that kept me from being victimized by my own son's addiction. I'd always prided myself on being independent, but this situation taught me that asking for help and accepting support isn't weakness, it's wisdom. The experience changed how I view my own aging too. Before this, I sometimes caught myself accepting the narrative that older people are vulnerable, forgetful, and need their adult children to manage their affairs. I let myself be talked over in doctor's appointments, assumed younger people knew better about technology or finances, and occasionally doubted my own judgment because society constantly sends the message that elderly minds are declining. But investigating Daniel's betrayal required me to be sharp, resourceful, and confident. I learned to use online banking, research legal issues, gather evidence, and advocate for myself with professionals. I discovered I was far more capable than I'd given myself credit for. Age brings wisdom, experience, and perspective that young people simply don't have. Those are strengths, not weaknesses. I've become an advocate for elder financial protection in my community now. I volunteer with a local senior center, teaching classes about recognizing financial exploitation and protecting assets. I share my story, carefully respecting Daniel's privacy about his addiction, but emphasizing the patterns of manipulation I experienced. So many elderly people face similar situations, but stay silent out of shame or fear of family conflict. The stories I hear from other seniors are heartbreaking. Adult children pressuring parents to sign over houses, relatives showing up only when money is needed, family members isolating elderly loved ones from others who might intervene. Financial exploitation of elders is epidemic, but it's rarely discussed openly because families want to keep problems private. I've learned that the stereotype of elder abuse being primarily perpetrated by strangers or caregivers is false. In most cases, the exploiters are family members, adult children, grandchildren, or relatives who feel entitled to someone's assets before they've actually inherited them. The emotional manipulation is often worse than the financial damage because it destroys trust in the people who should be your biggest protectors. My message to other seniors facing similar situations is simple. You have the right to keep your assets under your control for as long as you live. You don't owe your adult children early inheritances or financial bailouts, especially when their problems stem from their own poor choices. Setting boundaries doesn't make you a bad parent. It makes you a strong person who refuses to be victimized. I also tell families dealing with addiction that enabling and love are not the same thing. Supporting someone's recovery is loving. Funding their addiction is enabling. The distinction can feel blurry when it's your own child, because every parent wants to fix their children's problems. But some problems can only be fixed by the person living them, and the most loving thing you can do is refuse to prevent them from hitting the bottom that forces change. These days, my relationship with Daniel continues to evolve. We have Sunday dinners together when he's not working, and the conversations are more genuine than they've been in years. He talks honestly about his struggles and victories in recovery. He has shared about the shame he felt seeing his addiction through my eyes, the guilt of having tried to manipulate his own mother, and the ongoing work of rebuilding his self-worth through honest living. Sarah and Matthew have a grandfather again, not just a father who was physically present but emotionally absent due to addiction. They don't fully understand what happened, and they probably won't until they're older, but they can feel the difference in Daniel's presence and engagement. Linda and Daniel reconciled about 6 months ago, choosing to rebuild their marriage on a foundation of radical honesty and accountability. Linda maintains separate finances and has her own protections in place, but she's chosen to give their relationship another chance. I respect her decision while making sure she knows she has my support, regardless of what happens. The estate plan remains as I established it, with the trust structure protecting assets for my grandchildren's future. I've had conversations with Sarah and Matthew, age-appropriate ones, about the importance of managing money responsibly and understanding that wealth isn't something to be squandered or taken for granted. I hope my example teaches them that grandparents aren't just sources of inheritance, but whole people with rights, needs, and boundaries. I've also made peace with the possibility that Daniel might relapse. Addiction recovery isn't linear, and gambling addiction has high relapse rates. If he does fall back into old patterns, I've prepared myself emotionally and legally. The boundaries I've established aren't just for this moment. They're permanent protections regardless of what the future brings. Some family members, distant relatives who don't know the full story, have criticized my decision to essentially write Daniel out of the primary estate distribution. They see it as harsh or unforgiving, as holding his mistakes against him forever. But they don't understand that protecting the estate isn't punishment. It's practical wisdom born from painful experience. I've explained to those who listen that the trust structure actually benefits Daniel too. It removes the temptation that a large sum of money would represent to someone in recovery. It ensures his children are provided for, regardless of his choices. And it honors the decades of work Robert and I put into building this security, making sure it serves its intended purpose of family stability, rather than being lost to addiction. The most unexpected outcome of this entire ordeal has been the deepening of my own sense of self. I went into my 70s thinking my primary role was grandmother and widow, someone whose best years were behind her. This experience forced me to become an advocate, investigator, and boundary setter. It reminded me that I'm still a complete person with rights, intelligence, and strength. I look at the life Robert and I built with new appreciation. We were thoughtful and careful with our resources. We made sacrifices and delayed gratification to build security. That wasn't just about leaving money to our son. It was about honoring our own labor and creating stability that could weather storms. Protecting that legacy isn't selfish. It's stewarding what we worked for toward its intended purpose. I've also rediscovered aspects of myself that had been dormant. Learning to use technology to investigate Daniel's situation led to me taking computer classes at the library. I have my own laptop now and email regularly with old friends across the country. I've joined online communities for grandparents, raising awareness about elder financial abuse. I've even started writing down family stories and memories to pass on to Sarah and Matthew, creating a legacy beyond just financial assets. The cabin up north has become my sanctuary again, the way it was when Robert was alive. I spend weekends there during the summer, sometimes alone, sometimes with the grandchildren, occasionally with Daniel and Linda when we all need space to connect away from daily pressures. I've made improvements to the property, updating the old kitchen and adding a screened porch where I sit mornings with coffee, watching the lake wake up. These investments in the property aren't just maintenance. They're affirmations of my right to enjoy what Robert and I built for as long as I'm here. I'm not just preserving things for eventual inheritance. I'm living in and appreciating them myself. That shift in perspective has been liberating. I'm not merely a temporary custodian of assets waiting to pass them on. I'm an active owner and user of resources I earned. My health remains good, thankfully. I walk 3 miles most mornings, attend water aerobics twice a week, and volunteer regularly. I've been vigilant about preventive care and staying active because I want to live independently as long as possible. Part of protecting myself from manipulation means maintaining my physical and mental capabilities so no one can legitimately claim I need their help managing my affairs. I've had frank conversations with my doctors about my estate situation, making sure they understand that Daniel is not authorized to receive medical information or make decisions on my behalf, without Linda and Rebecca also being involved. I've signed advance directives clearly laying out my wishes for end-of-life care, removing any ambiguity that could lead to conflict or manipulation when I'm most vulnerable. These preparations might sound morbid, but they're actually empowering. By planning explicitly for scenarios where I can't advocate for myself, I'm extending my autonomy into the future. I'm ensuring my voice continues to be heard and respected, even if I lose the ability to speak it directly. The legal complaint I filed with Adult Protective Services was investigated thoroughly. While no criminal charges were ultimately filed because I'd stopped Daniel before he successfully stole anything, the investigation is on record. It serves as documentation that could be referenced if he ever tried similar manipulation with others, or if my estate plan were challenged. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about creating an official record of truth. Martin Fletcher has become not just my lawyer, but a trusted advisor and friend. We meet quarterly to review my estate plan and make sure everything remains aligned with my wishes and circumstances. He's helped me understand that estate planning isn't a one-time event but an ongoing process that should evolve as life changes. His guidance gave me confidence during the darkest moments of Daniel's betrayal. I've recommended Martin to several friends who've realized, hearing my story, that they need to review and strengthen their own estate protections. It sparked conversations in my social circle about elder financial exploitation, with many people sharing their own experiences of family members pressuring them about inheritances or trying to gain control of assets prematurely. There's a particular kind of pain in being betrayed by your own child that's difficult to articulate. Parents spend decades nurturing, protecting, and sacrificing for their children. We envision being cared for in our later years, or at minimum, being treated with respect and honesty. When that expectation is violated, it shakes your fundamental understanding of family bonds. I've processed this pain through therapy too. Yes, at 72, I started seeing a counselor for the first time in my life. It felt strange initially, discussing my problems with someone decades younger. But my therapist helped me work through the grief of losing the relationship I thought I had with Daniel, the guilt I felt for not seeing his addiction sooner, and the anger about being manipulated by someone I trusted completely. Therapy taught me that I can hold multiple truths simultaneously. I love my son, and he hurt me deeply. He's sick with addiction, and he made choices that were morally wrong. I want him to recover, and I won't compromise my security to enable him. These aren't contradictions. They're the complex reality of loving someone whose disease made them dangerous to me. The grandchildren have been a source of joy throughout this difficult period. Sarah, now 14, is developing into a thoughtful young woman who asks deep questions about family, trust, and responsibility. Matthew, 12, is at that wonderful age where he's curious about everything and believes he can fix any problem with enough determination. They don't know all the details of what happened between their father and me, but they know there were serious problems that required boundaries and healing. I've been intentional about modeling healthy conflict resolution for them. They've seen that you can love someone while protecting yourself from their harmful behaviors. They've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean allowing someone to hurt you repeatedly. They've watched their father work hard in recovery and observed the gradual rebuilding of relationships through earned trust rather than assumed family obligation. These lessons might be the most valuable inheritance I can give them, more lasting than money or property. They're learning to have boundaries, to recognize manipulation, to value honesty, and to understand that love sometimes means difficult choices. These are skills that will serve them throughout their lives, in all their relationships. I think about Robert often, wishing he were here to navigate this with me. But in many ways, his absence was part of what triggered Daniel's crisis. Robert had been the strong presence, the authority figure Daniel respected and perhaps feared disappointing. When Robert died, something in Daniel broke loose, the discipline and motivation to maintain appearances. His gambling escalated from occasional to compulsive, from manageable to life-destroying. I wonder sometimes if Robert would have handled things differently, whether his approach would have been firmer or more lenient. I think he would have been devastated by Daniel's betrayal, but ultimately proud of how I stood my ground. Robert always said I was stronger than I believed, that I just needed the right circumstances to reveal it. This was certainly the circumstance, though not one either of us would have chosen. The house feels different now, lighter somehow. For the first year after Robert's death, grief saturated every room. Then Daniel's manipulation added a layer of tension and anxiety that made home feel unsafe. But now, with boundaries established and recovery underway, the house has become mine again, in a new way. It's not just the place Robert and I built together. It's the sanctuary I defended and maintained through crisis. I've redecorated slightly, not erasing Robert's presence, but adding my own touches. New curtains in the living room, a reading nook by the window, a garden space in the backyard where I grow vegetables and flowers. These changes represent my ongoing life, not just preservation of the past. I'm not frozen in widowhood or defined by my role as Daniel's mother. I'm Margaret, a whole person still growing and changing. The investment portfolio that Daniel tried to access has grown substantially since I took full control and worked with a new financial advisor recommended by Martin. I review statements monthly, ask questions when I don't understand something, and make informed decisions about the investments. This active engagement with my finances has been empowering, replacing the old pattern where I deferred to Robert or assumed others knew better. I've used some of the investment returns to fund Sarah's math tutoring program and Matthew's robotics club, investments in their education that bring me more satisfaction than any return percentage. I've also made donations to gambling addiction treatment programs and elder advocacy organizations, using money to support causes that address the issues I faced personally. This active use of assets, rather than just hoarding them for eventual distribution, reflects my changed perspective. The estate isn't just a static thing to be passed down. It's a tool to improve lives and address problems in real time. I can be generous and supportive while still maintaining boundaries against exploitation. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Looking ahead, I have realistic expectations about the future. My relationship with Daniel will likely always carry scars from this period. We'll probably never return to the uncomplicated trust of his childhood or the comfortable assumptions of early adulthood. But we're building something new, more honest and resilient perhaps than what existed before. I hope to see Sarah and Matthew graduate high school, maybe college, if I'm fortunate enough to live that long. I want to witness Daniel sustain his recovery long enough that sobriety becomes his default rather than a daily battle. I'd like to see Linda find peace, whether that's ultimately with Daniel or independently. If their reconciliation doesn't last, I plan to enjoy the resources Robert and I worked for, rather than just preserving them. More trips to visit old friends, improvements to the cabin, maybe even learning to paint like I always wanted to when I was younger. I'm not saving everything for some future that might not come. I'm living now, while protecting what needs to be protected. The estate plan will remain as structured, with professional management ensuring controlled distributions that serve the grandchildren's genuine needs, rather than enabling potential destructive behaviors. I've made peace with the reality that this might disappoint Daniel or feel like a permanent mark of distrust. But the plan isn't about punishment or lack of forgiveness. It's about responsible stewardship of resources toward their intended purpose. I've written letters to Sarah and Matthew to be opened when they're older, explaining the full story of what happened during this period and the reasons behind the estate structure. They deserve to understand the context, not just inherit rules without explanation. I want them to know that protecting family assets isn't about loving money more than people. It's about loving people enough to make hard choices that serve long-term well-being over short-term comfort. In the end, I learned that respect isn't automatically granted because of age or family relationship. It's earned through consistent behavior and sometimes demanded through firm boundaries. I learned that protecting yourself from exploitation isn't selfish or unloving. It's necessary self-preservation that actually serves the greater good by refusing to enable destructive behavior. I learned that being elderly doesn't mean being helpless or confused. Despite society's stereotypes, and despite what family members might claim when trying to manipulate you, our minds remain sharp, our judgment sound, and our rights intact. regardless of age. We deserve to be treated as competent adults who can make our own decisions about our own resources. I learned that addiction is a disease that can turn even loving children into manipulative strangers. But that disease doesn't absolve them of responsibility for their choices or obligate you to sacrifice your security to their chaos. Supporting recovery is loving. Enabling active addiction is not. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to advocate for yourself, to establish boundaries, to demand respect, and to live with dignity. At 72, I found strength I didn't know I possessed. I became an investigator, advocate, decision maker, and boundary setter. I protected not just my assets, but my autonomy and self-worth. This journey from betrayal to empowerment wasn't what I expected for my 70s, but it taught me lessons I needed to learn. I hope sharing this story helps other seniors recognize exploitation early, find courage to stand firm against family manipulation, and understand that protecting yourself is